Awesome. All right, welcome everyone. Alex Steppen here,
Mike Harris.
we're the directors of Steppen Town Planning. We've been getting a lot of questions about the amendments to the planning regulation from the industry, so we thought we'd put together a bit of a presentation on what we're finding. And we'll jump into a bit of the detail about it and the issues we're finding. So, disclaimer, as always, this is general information only. It's mostly our opinion and interpretation of bits of legislation. So if you have any particular questions about things, feel free to get in touch with us. We can give you formal planning advice. And we're always keen to have a chat regardless. So flick us an email or give us a call. Email's probably the best way to get in touch with us, to be honest with you. So late last year, a lot of amendments happened to the planning regulation. So today, what we're going to talk about is those amendments, why they happened and what they are, the key impacts that they've had from a practical point of view. So we have seen on LinkedIn, we've seen lawyers weigh in, state governments released a bunch of explanatory notes, but a lot of it doesn't really help from a practical point of view in what actually happens on the ground. So we're going to go into that a little bit and tell you, our experiences of that interpretation from our point of view as town planners, and then what we're hearing from the rest of the industry, from certifiers, building designers, and architects. So this is kind of more of a discussion style presentation, less of a informative. This is the exact interpretation, and this is the situation. So don't leave here and say, well, I went to the Steppen Town Planning webinar and they said this, therefore that's gospel, because it most certainly is not, but this is what we think is happening. We did offer to the state government to attend and present, so they're the ones who wrote the legislation. They didn't want to attend, or they said that they didn't need to, and they directed us to the explanatory notes on their website. I don't know if you've read the notes, they're not super helpful, for what we found anyway. And then we found just yesterday or the day before, they announced that they're doing a presentation tomorrow, actually, on, I think, the same topic, but it's $30 to attend via peer. So make that, interpret that however you like, but it's a bit of a shame that they are charging to give you advice, which is quite bizarre. So, bit of a timeline of the events. So late last year, obviously we've got this housing and affordability crisis. There was an emergency housing summit held by the state government, the Premier, I believe. And almost overnight, as a result of that, 26th of September, there was an amendment to the regulation that allowed you to rent a granny flat. So it was called the Dwelling House Secondary Dwelling Amendment. Really, all it did was the state government did a media announcement and said, hey, we're doing stuff straight away and you can rent your granny flat now. So that's fine. A lot of issues with that, and this is what we'll go into today. 2nd of December, they realized some of the issues that they created with the 26th of September amendment. So they came up with another one, which is loosely the Rooming Accommodation and Dwelling House Amendment. So what that aimed to do is prohibit council from actually assessing granny flats and houses, trying to make it more affordable and easier for people to get those kinds of projects underway. Then the 16th of December, there was another amendment about rural workers accommodation and some stuff about battery storage and really stuff that's only very particular for a very small group of people. And then again, on the 14th of March this year, they put an infrastructure plan for Caboolture West, which was, realistically a bit of a mess. So in the past kind of 6 months, we've had more amendments to the regulation than I can even remember, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's been a few.
And it's been overwhelming to interpret these things, especially when maybe they weren't real. I think they were thought out. They maybe weren't put into practice before they were released, is my comment.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that and go into that next few slides.
So the ones we're going to concentrate on are the 26th of September and the 2nd of December amendments, because this is the one that we really find is going to have a lot of impact on the industry. So the 26th of September, the amendment basically changed the definitions to allow you to rent a granny flat. So they did this by changing the definition of a household and secondary dwellings by omitting certain words. And also omitting certain words from the Dwelling House and Dual Occupancy Code. So I'm not going to go into the detail of it. there's a bunch of lawyers who have already gone into the detail of it. It's on LinkedIn. I'm sure if you Google it, you'll find them all going from the city that's gone through the technical side of this. But essentially what it means is you can now have more than one household group in a dwelling house. So that means you can have one dwelling, a primary dwelling with a household group in it, and a secondary dwelling with a household group in it. Therefore, you can rent a grey flat. You think that that's pretty much the summary?
Yeah, it is. And obviously up until that point, as you can see on the right there, if we've taken the section from the amendment that was released, and that does go through the technical aspects of it. But as you can see, they're removing a whole bunch of references to household and limiting it to a household, a single household. And then legally had to go change a whole bunch of other things about dual occupancy definitions to make sure that if you have two households, it's not called a dual occupancy.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's the simplest way to kind of describe it, is that there is, caveats to that, but essentially that was the intent anyway of what that amendment did.
So key issues that arise from that, and I was on almost the day after I was on ABC News, Brisbane Radio, talking about this. So the state government's come out and said, yeah, you can rent a granny flat, but there is still issues with local planning schemes. For example, Brisbane at the time had provision in A01 of their dwelling house and dwelling house small lot code that specifically said, despite the definitions, you can only have one household group. And because they said one household group, it meant that you couldn't have two in a primary and secondary dwelling. So as much as they made these amendments, in reality, in the areas that mattered, like Brisbane and bigger metro areas, you still couldn't actually rent a granny flat. So it kind of did some things, and what it then put into motion is Brisbane amended their planning scheme in March this year to then actually allow you to rent a granny flat. So the achievement of this amendment, rent your granny flat. So, and that pretty much applies to most areas. There are some key issues. So Logan, for example, have decided that they're going to charge infrastructure contributions. So if you want to have a rentable granny flat, they're going to charge you between $22,000 and $31,000. And the other issue, which I think is probably worthy of discussion, is whether or not, like, how many empty granny flats are there? Like, are people going to be kicking out granny to rent their granny flat to someone? And then how economical is it, or how feasible is it to actually rent a granny flat? So I did a presentation, or did a podcast with Streamline Property Buyers a few weeks ago, and on there was a gentleman who is kind of one of Australia's leading and up and coming rental managers. And he basically said it is extremely difficult to rent a granny flat. So it's like, they did these provisions, it looks all fancy. In reality, has it achieved much? I personally don't think it has. Have we had many inquiries about renting granny flats?
Not overly. And it's also like, obviously these kind of things do take a while to construct and then put into practice. So, the amendments were made in what had been outlined in December and September last year. And then obviously only Brisbane has now only 2 months ago agreed that we can do it. So we're not seeing it. And I would say of all the markets, Brisbane's probably the most suitable, because actually, that's my opinion, but obviously most suitable given the fact that there is some density issues and there are the demand, for people to be in those spaces more so than ever. But yeah, there's definitely other regions. That's why I paused there. Obviously, Ipswich, where we are based as well, there is a significant affordability crisis there and rental prices. So there may be options there for that, but at the same time, it's costing a lot to build at the moment. So it's taking a long time. So it's all a bit of fun and games, I think. But we'll see. Hopefully in a few more months there might be some positive outcomes there. So.
Yeah, and we're using Brisbane as an example, but these provisions actually apply a bit on Queensland. So you could be up at Townsville and you can apply the same legislation. So across Queensland, you can now rent granny flat. So obviously there were problems with that, and on the 2nd of December, there was another round of amendments, because at the time there was no feedback from Brisbane City Council, for example, as to whether or not they're going to change their planning scheme to allow you to rent a granny flat. So at the time, there was kind of this big, good work, state government, you've kind of achieved nothing. I don't think that they achieved nothing, but I don't think that they achieved what they went and sought to achieve. So this amendment, in my opinion, was kind of fixing the issues or the holes that they've had with that previous amendment to the regulation. So how they did this is that they put in Schedule 6 of the planning regulation, which is the part that makes things prohibited from assessment by local council. So by bypassing council altogether, they're kind of removing the ability for local councils to have specific planning provisions that stop you from renting granny flats. How they did this, they also included, so they made prohibited from assessment for dwelling houses, and a dwelling house includes a primary and a secondary dwelling. And they also threw in that you can do a 5-bedroom rooming accommodation under the same provisions. So if you do it on Brisbane, a 5-bedroom rooming accommodation will be very familiar to you. But outside of Brisbane, it's pretty much, you can't do it unless you're in, a high density zone, in which case it probably doesn't make sense to do it anyway. So they then blanketed that across the whole of the state. So there is a bit more to this amendment that we'll go into. But essentially, this amendment was about making housing easier to build without council getting involved, and 5-bedroom rooming accommodation easier to build without council getting involved. So here's a bit of I know that everyone absolutely loves reading legislation, so we've put more in here for you. So here's part of the section relevant to rooming accommodation. Mike, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll run you through that one. So obviously you've got the two sections there, 4 and 5, under that subsection. 4 is about if you're converting an existing dwelling or existing building into rooming home. So essentially just goes through and outlines what the rules and regulations there. But essentially, yeah, up to 5 bedrooms. And as long as there's no significant overlays, essentially you can relatively easily do it as long as you talk to your certifier and obviously make sure it's all to code, the retrofit. And then section 5 there also runs through the building and brand new one. So it runs through where you can do it, where you can't do it. But it's reasonably straightforward. Essentially, as long as you're not in the state control road and you don't have any overlays, you should be able to do it subject to design and compliance. So it's quite progressive, I think. It's great because a lot of we'll go into this a bit further through the slideshow, but a lot of councils up until recently were quite reluctant to adopt the idea of rooming home, and from what we're hearing in the industry, there's a lot of driving forces for people in that space who want to rent these rooms. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think there's a bit of a stigma attached to it that I think some councils are going to have to work through. I think there's, in places like Logan and Moreton Bay, I think they generally think that rooming accommodation developments are going to be filled up full of criminals. Not the case in 90% of instances. So I think there'll be this transition of councils getting used to this definition. It's been in Brisbane forever, or since 2014, it's almost 10 years. But coming outside of Brisbane and going through the whole of Queensland, where this is something that you can do now, I think there's a lot of potential for those kind of metro, larger, small city areas or near universities and services like hospitals. So yeah, I think that's a really progressive move by the state. Then obviously they've done the same thing for dwelling houses. So a small extract here. Again, you can basically do a dwelling house, including a secondary dwelling. It's prohibited from council from assessing it, so long as it's in a residential zone other than a medium density or high density residential zone. It doesn't involve a basement or an underground parking area, which we'll talk about in a second. And it's not an irrelevant overlay or a hazardous overlay. So I've put the definition of relevant overlay there. So this is a new thing that came into the regulation when this happened. A relevant overlay is basically anything that would have some impact on the development of the site. So like bushfire, landslide hazard, mining, heritage, character, biodiversity, airport, noise. So if it's something you've got an overlay, like trying to think of a dwelling house character overlay or a residential overlay, which is what councils use to trigger applications, they're completely irrelevant. So council can't use that to trigger a development application. What will be interesting to see is if councils start trying to put on broader character overlays to fall into that traditional building character. But time will tell. So massive implications this amendment to the regulation had. The biggest issue that we are coming across is the fact that if you look at all of this. Number 4, it says a material change of use for a premises. Number 5, a material change of use for a premises. This amendment, the material change of use is 4. So you'll notice that it only ever references a material change of use. So it's actually only valid for new buildings or new changes of use. So turning a house into a rooming accommodation or building a brand new house. So it's not actually for extensions to dwelling houses, which creates a massive issue, which we'll talk about in the next slide. It also doesn't include emerging community sites, which cover a lot of those greenfield areas where new development's happening. So where there's kind of pockets of opportunity for affordable housing and streamlined housing to happen, they can't do it. So that's another issue that we see. This reference to does not involve a basement or underground parking area is very interesting. I know, Mike, you've had a bit to do with this.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one because it's, from our review of it anyway, or at least mine, it kind of cancels each other out a bit. So essentially they're saying that if you have a basement, then you obviously can't use these extensions. Or if you have underground parking, you can't either. And so our internal discussions here, at least, were around what is underground, like, and from what I've heard from people in the industry, that particular councils have been coming back to them saying, well, you're excavating 300 mils, 200 mils to create, on a sloping site to create parking or a garage, that's underground, But then, given this and the uncertainty around this, we reached out to the state to see if they can clarify for us. That's that snip there below, the bottom of the screen there. So they essentially said that this is, a basement is defined in the regulation, and that's the definition there. It's been that way for a long time now. It's no different, no changes there. Essentially, as long as you're less than a meter out of the ground, between the floor level above.
And that's getting tested.
There's legal case law on that too. It's been around for ages. I'm sure everyone is aware of it with Brisbane, Brisbane particularly, dealing with 3 stories and what's not a basement. But then obviously there's the uncertainty around what is underground, what is an underground parking area, which is the second part under that of that little snip. They essentially just write that saying that you can use the dictionary meaning because there's no definition under the regulations. So doesn't really clarify for us, because essentially if you look it up, like in Macquarie or wherever you want to go to, essentially just means literally under the ground. We, like me personally, and I think internally, we've kind of all come to the consensus that, it should be fully under the ground, like we can't be partially under the ground, but once again, let's say partially or fully in the definition. And then essentially the last sentence there, it says, or he or she responded, it's not named. So if you're underground, you're looking underground that is not otherwise classified as a basement. So then you go back through and search ahead, to be honest with you. Because it should be something that's really quite simple, but and it made it really quite complicated, and they haven't clarified anything there at all. Essentially, they just said if it's located underground, there's not otherwise a basement. So if you're not a basement,
explain to me the situation where you could be underground and not be a basement.
Because so we haven't got anywhere really on that, unfortunately, which is that makes it very difficult for certifiers in particular who are trying to obviously argue this through with council, and it makes it really annoying when they come back and obviously want you to then lodge a DA, and the left out kind of thing. So
so the important thing to know with this is, if in these previous slides you can kind of see that if you're not hitting all of these, then immediately that exemption is not applicable anymore. So if council determined that you are proposing some underground parking, which is not a defined use and not a defined term, so no one really knows what it means, then that exemption does not apply. So very, very confusing. I don't know why it's
undefined too, so it's up to everyone's discretion. So
Why?
bets.
Why would they include that?
Like code actually makes the whole thing fall apart a lot. So, 'cause as I said, if you like a lot of sites need a small amount of benching or a small amount of excavation, like if you're putting a 1 meter high wall at the back and making it a flat site, technically you may be digging out for your garage slightly. So yeah, it really makes it an issue if that's how they're going to interpret it. I think if everyone puts their common sense hats on, it's not how it should be interpreted, but yeah, we're still trying to get some precedent around that and further information on that.
Yeah, so if you've attended this webinar, you'll likely be on our mailing list. So we will keep everyone up to date by the mailing list. We're still pushing it. We're still trying to get clarification around that. I think, as Mike said, the common sense approach, I think, is probably the best approach to take at this point, because why could you have a basement? Sorry. Yeah, it's not otherwise last basement. Yeah, we could go on the surface. So you can see we deal with this all every single day. We've been dealing with this new amendment to the regulations since December, and we still aren't 100% sure. Clearly, the state government who wrote it still aren't 100% sure, and every single council seemingly has their own interpretation of it. So, just when it comes to anything that's underground, be cautious, and certainly worth having a discussion with your planner, with us, or council. So moving on from that issue, which we could talk about all day, weirdly, this doesn't mean that siting variations aren't required. So what we're finding, and it's starting to come through, siting variations are going to be the new DA. They're going to be just as scrutinized by council. It kind of goes through the same process. So it hasn't really changed a lot where you need a siting variation. Which is interesting as to how this actually plays out. The best way that we thought that we could explain this is doing some case studies.
And sorry, just before we go on, just so Brisbane, for example, on the back slide. So obviously when you're doing siting variation with Brisbane, for those who aren't aware, like it's the same team. So House and Homes is the team that assesses both the variation requests and both the DAs that we lodge with suitable house issues. So yeah, it seems that the plan isn't there being a lot more thorough, which is what I've been hearing for the last few years anyway, because they've made that shift a few years back, but it just seems like they're just going to continue that, if not even worse.
Yeah. So potentially the amendment hasn't achieved anything again. We'll get into it. So going through some case studies. So Brisbane, and this is where we're finding a lot of building designers and certifiers are not familiar with these amendments and how they impact on designs. So in Brisbane, because it only covers a material change of use, these amendments to the regulation and these exemptions, you've got this issue between an extension, which is not a material change of use, it's building works, and a new house, which is a material change of use. So comparing the two, if you were doing an extension to a house in Brisbane on a small lot, then you have this variable site cover provision that allows you kind of between 50 to 80% site coverage, depending on how small the site is. So if you're like in Petrie Terrace on a 200 square meter site, then you could build 80% of the site. But if you had a vacant block of land in the same street and you were building a new house, not an extension, then the QDC will say 50% maximum. So in the instance of trying to get more site coverage, you're actually better off doing an extension versus a new build. So I'm waiting for the situation where someone builds a house with 50% site coverage and then goes for an extension under the small lot code, which is then allowed.
Well, just on that too, or if they are proposing 70% site cover and they want to do a relaxation but council knocks it back, then they might revert to doing what Alex just said of building an initial house and it's 50.
Yeah.
And then,
And not needing it together.
And maybe it's a week later building the rest. So yeah, it'll be fun.
Yeah. Again, if you're doing an extension to a house, then you can build 9.5 meters in height and 2 stories under the planning scheme. If you're building a brand new house, then it's actually 8.5 meters maximum height and an undefined number of stories. So you can build higher as an extension than you could if you were building a brand new dwelling. And this is not to say that you could do a variation, aside of like a variation and concurrence agency referral to council and still get the height. But the fact is, you're now lodging an application whereas previously you didn't need to. Similarly, if you're doing an extension for a granny flat, just say you want to rent a granny flat and you want to build one. If you're just doing one off the back of your house, the provisions still apply. So you have 80 square meters maximum. It's got to be within 20 meters of the primary dwelling. Versus if you're building a new house and a granny flat at the same time, then under the QDC, there's no maximum provisions. There's no siding requirements. So you could actually build a bigger granny flat in a further distance from the primary dwelling as a new build versus as an extension. So understanding the difference between building works and the material change of use is really important to be across when you're doing this, because the provisions for extension are very different for provisions for a new build. So taking through some scenarios, and these are things that we come across almost daily. If you had a small lot in Brisbane and you wanted to build a new house, a brand new house, and a 6 meter wide carport on the small lot, then no DA necessary. So straight to the certifier, may need a siding variation, probably would need one. But you're essentially allowed to do that. Versus if you wanted to do that carport as an extension to an existing dwelling, then you're going to trigger a development application under the dwelling house smaller code, and it'll go through the normal DA process and be pretty heavily scrutinized and potentially be refused by council. So in that instance, new house fine, extension not fine. So if you had vacant block of land and an existing house, one probably could build a 6 meter wide carport. One you might not be able to. So very, very confusing. Scenario 2, and I've kind of covered this. If you're building a new house and you're trying to make it 9.5 meters in height in a street full of 9.5 meter houses, then technically the maximum height's 8.5 meters. So you'd have to drop 1 meter lower than everyone. But if you built that 8.5 meter high house and then want to do an extension to it, you could then build 9.5 meters in height. So, just an odd complexity that you're just going to have to account for. And again, the last scenario, which I also covered off, if you're building a granny flat as part of a new house, it could be as big as you want, so long as you can justify that it is a secondary dwelling or a granny flat. Versus if it was an extension, then really you still fall back to those provisions under the dwelling house code, which is 80 square meters with GFA and within 20 meters of the primary dwelling. Now, what does this mean, Mike?
Yeah, so over the last little bit of time, I've been discussing these issues with clients who are building new houses, and then what's been happening with the building certifiers who've been lodging these relaxations. And essentially what has been happening is Brisbane City Council are falling back on this part of the planning scheme. So this is a section from the Brisbane City Plan 2014. And it's at the front, obviously in section 1. And it does point us to the fact that they do have the right to kind of assess as a referral agency items that they declare as significant amenity and aesthetic impacts. So they've been saying back to someone, for example, if you are coming in with a 3-story house that is 9 meters high or something, so you're going in for 9 meters for a relapse, or even just 3 stories with a side boundary relapse, so you might be just like just the scenario is you're 3 stories, so they obviously want to be 2 in the low density zone. And they can't stay under 8.5 meters in height, right? So you comply with QDC with the height, but then you're non-compliant with, let's say, a front setback, side setback, rear setback, or something like that, where you need to get a relaxation. And then they will request them to be lodging, this kind of permit as well, which then allows them to draw on the house code or the small lot code, which has those provisions in it about 2 stories and 9.5 meters.
Yeah.
So
you end up doing the same code as for the normal DA.
And this is the same deal with the secondary dwelling scenario you're going through. So if you are, you may very well be like, well, let's do 100 square meters, we're doing it as a new build. They will come back and say this applies, and because of this, you need to get a permit from us for it to be relaxed above 80 square meters. So it's not all smooth sailing, unfortunately, at this point. I don't know legally where we sit with this aspect of the scheme. A lot of the certifiers I've been speaking to have been saying that they don't exactly agree with it, because if you are compliant, for example, that scenario under the QDC, why would they have the right to say that you're not, you're imposing a significant amenity impact assessment, impact, to the locality. Yeah, so it's once again a bit of a mess.
Yeah, and we should say this part of the planning scheme has been there since day one.
Yeah,
So this has always been there. And certifiers could pull on this if they wanted to. We've never really seen council pull on it. But if you're doing, for example, an accepted development extension to a character house, so building at the back of a character house, if you're doing something really modern, then and it didn't need approval, then a certifier could actually still have called upon this part of the scheme and gone, well, we think it could have an extreme conflict with the character of the locality. Therefore, we still need to lodge an application as an amenity and aesthetics impact referral to council, and the same codes are applicable to a normal development application. So the risk is for people that even if you don't trigger a development application and you're doing stuff in accordance with the QDC, there is a risk that council could still call on this requirement, and the certifier could actually also call upon this requirement, and then you just need the same assessment process, but it's just called something different.
and like obviously the section, like the bottom two parts of these don't really impose that much, because obviously, well, the traditional building character overlay aspect probably would be lodging a DA anyway, because you're a relevant overlay, which we mentioned earlier. But the other thing we've been hearing too is that the fees from council to be lodging all these relaxations and these amenities and referrals, that they're pretty much, if not the same, slightly more in some scenarios, depending on how many elements you need to get relaxed, than lodging a DA. So I'm not sure in terms of like the intent from the state to make this all affordable and easier, whether we're there yet.
It's potentially made it more, maybe faster, but it's potentially made it more expensive.
Yeah.
Which is, unless,
but it's also like, what's the flow and effect here though? Because if we're all designing things and advising you to design things a certain way, and then council changes their mind or wants to draw on these legal aspects to make it fully compliant with a different code, then essentially they've blown the customer's budget too on having to get a redesign done, and it probably wasn't what it was started. It was just black and white as to what was required. So we are having a Q&A at the end. So I'd like to hear from anyone else who's had experiences with this, because obviously it is all very new. It's only been we'll say 5 months since, because they announced it in late December, mid-December, right? So there's not much examples out there at the moment, particularly with font and stuff like that. So we are interested to hear from everyone else with that experience. So.
Yeah, definitely. So something to note, we deal with this part of the plan. Brisbane, for example, we deal with this all day, every day, non-stop, and we have been for the past 15, 20 years. So I don't think that the state government just knew that this existed. They definitely didn't, because how would they know? They don't deal with it all day, every day. So, I don't think that the state government's done a bad job here. I think that these things just come out in the wash and they need to be dealt with. Moving on from Brisbane, because that is just can of worms. Logan have always referred back to the QDC for when you're building a house. So whether you're building an extension to a house or a new house, nothing's really changed in Logan, to be honest with you. So the amendments haven't achieved that much from a house point of view. That said, now that you can rent a granny flat, in March this year, Logan decided, well, we don't want to let you rent a granny flat. We're going to charge you, it'll create extra demand on our services and infrastructure. So therefore, we're going to charge you double the amount of infrastructure charges. So in my discussions with Logan, they've indicated that they're going to be charged on the infrastructure charges notice. They'll basically put 2 dwelling houses on there, which in my opinion is not lawful. If you've got 2 dwelling houses on an infrastructure charges notice, that would be a dual occupancy. And they can't write 2 household groups, because that's just 1 dwelling house. And then the charge is 31 grand, not 62. So be cautious in Logan. They will hit you with double infrastructure charges depending on how many bedrooms you have, which again is like immediately backfired on the state government. It's like, you can rent a granny flat now. Then you've got Logan going, yeah, you can, but we're going to make it even more unaffordable. So that's just a bit of a shame. Where the win is in Logan is that rooming accommodation, those 5-bedroom ones that we talked about earlier, used to be impact accessible everywhere other than higher density zones. And it used to be inconsistent. Council did not want them. Whereas now, go for gold. So you can do them through the whole of Logan now, as long as you're in the zone we talked about earlier. Logan, again, infrastructure charges, they will try to ping you, I guarantee. If it does not look authentically like a one suite, so bedrooms coming off a communal kitchen and dining area, I guarantee they're going to try to hit you with infrastructure charges of $20,000 per room. So again, potentially backfire, making it more unaffordable, but at least there's some more options there. Moreton Bay, much the same as Logan, in terms of doing extensions or a new build. So not much has really changed. Again, with rooming accommodation, that's where we've seen huge change. So now through Moreton Bay, you can do 5-bedroom rooming accommodations wherever you want. So long as you, again, you meet those provisions. Beware of infrastructure charges. We haven't seen a lot of these happen yet, so there is a risk that Moreton Bay will try to charge you per room, which will blow the budget immediately. We're talking, $100,000 extra charges potentially. Now, Ipswich is an interesting one. So Ipswich planning scheme's from 2006. So it's actually written under the IPA, which is the Integrated Planning Act from 1997. And they haven't fully updated their planning scheme to transition to SPA, which is the Standard Planning Act, and the Planning Act. So the feedback that we've got from Ipswich City Council directly is that none of these amendments to the regulation are relevant to their council region, which is questionable, because they certainly adopt parts of the Planning Act and the regulation where it kind of benefits them.
When it definitely suits them.
When it suits them, they'll very much pull on it.
It definitely fits when they want it to.
Yeah.
We haven't really tested it. We've just kind of left it. We haven't really had too many inquiries either for people wanting to test it. It'd be interesting to see if we can get, if there are people interested in that space, whether it is worth doing it. It's one of those things though, otherwise, like if we're just doing granny flats, like how much money are we willing to spend, like per person? If there are people interested in looking in that space, we may look to crowdfund it.
Yeah,
We have done that before with rooming accommodations in dual occupancies and then multiple dwellings and stuff like that. We do crowdsource. If there are people interested in that, let us know. I'm sure.
That also said, halfway through this month, Ipswich are going to announce their amendment, their formal amendment to a new planning scheme.
Yes. Yeah.
So we only got that word late yesterday. So that'll happen.
But it's still going to be months before it's live and adopted. So
up to years potentially.
But you would assume that the states sign that off. So it seems like progress is being made, which is great.
So that's all we had. I know that that's a lot to take in very quickly. So if you do have any questions that you want us to clarify, if you think that we're complete idiots and that we're going down a complete wrong interpretation of all these things, let us know. We'd like to know. We have a lot of free resources on our website. So if you're building designer, certifier, general developer, or another planner, even for that instance, there's lots of free content on there. So please go check it out. Does anyone have any questions? I need to get out of this.
I've got it up here. Just feel free to chuck it into chat. Into the chat channel. I've got it up here, or alternatively, we are flicking over so you can raise your hand to come on the camera if you want as well.
Okay. Oh wow, there's lots of.
I'll just verbalize a few of them. So Claude, I think you had a question about when's the state running the seminar. So I think it's tomorrow at lunchtime. I've planted the link there in the chat for those who are interested. It's on here. So Planning Institute Australia are running it. They are charging annually for it. $30, I think it is. It's online too, so you don't have to go anywhere. It is there. For those interested.
Yeah, it's really annoying with that. It's like why do you have to pay to get access to information that should be readily available to everyone. Like if you ask clarification from the people who wrote it, they should be able to, give you some feedback, but unfortunately not. And now seemingly to get feedback, you need to pay $30. But it is what it is. So that's why we do things like this to try to help out and keep the conversation going in a free environment. Here we go. It's more. Has the number of separate parties for room accommodation increased? Oops, sorry, I lost that. Yeah, the population increased.
I think it was yearly. That's right. I apologize if we didn't. So
yeah, so it used to be 6. So years and years ago, it used to be able to have a 6-bedroom rooming accommodation without approval, I believe. But it's 5.
It's been 5 for a while, unfortunately. These amendments adopt 5, unfortunately. So we do have clients who look to subdivide the site so we can do 2 5s, so and it's a lot simpler for certifiers to build it that way rather than 10 or 12 or whatever. Like sometimes it does get up into class, so it's worth looking at that. For sure.
Adam Jones, how's it going? Thanks for attending. Do we have any comment on the removal of the 5-person cap from the definition of the dwelling house code in Brisbane? Do we see that creates any opportunities? So what I was talking about is under the dwelling house code, it used to have a provision in there saying that you can only have 5 unrelated parties.
Yeah.
And that's gone now to allow you to rent a granny flat, essentially. That part of the planning scheme, I feel like, has never been enforced in its entire existence. I don't see that it creates any new opportunities, other than its intent, which is by removing it, which is allowing you to have 2 household groups. I mean, you might be able to fill up a 12-bedroom dwelling house. But if you're renting it like a rooming accommodation, then it's a rooming accommodation, not a house anymore. So I don't really see that creates any new opportunities.
But I guess it does definitely. If you do have an investment property or the like, which you are renting out, it may very well be a 6-bedroom, and you are doing 1 lease on it. It does, I guess, alleviate any concerns legally you would have on that. Because technically prior to that amendment, you were not compliant. So especially if you rented to non-related people, I think it wasn't it? So far related people or unrelated people. So so I guess there are small opportunities there, but I wouldn't say it's a massive one. I think if it's once again one of these things, if the compliance team at council got a whiff of it, they would probably suggest you were a rooming accommodation if you were over 5 or 6 bedrooms.
Great question here from Gavin O'Donnell. Thanks for attending. So he's asked, what would the process be if council call up an amenity aesthetics assessment? Wouldn't that be a DA? So this is the funny thing. So it's kind of the same process, but it's not a DA.
Yeah, so it goes through the rule of role agency provisions at building approval stage.
Yeah.
It just gets tacked on essentially. But it does mean that you have to go through and do a full assessment against those codes, essentially as you would the DA.
Yeah, and the comment that you've made here, so new home side setbacks on small lots are to the outermost projection, but the small lot code in Brisbane is to the wall. So I would say that the comment there is alluding to the fact that under the small lot code, you can actually have a reduced setback versus the QTC. So you'd be better off doing an extension to a house in Brisbane than you would be doing a new house if you're going for smaller setbacks, which is, odd. Franklin, thanks for attending. Can an existing dwelling house be converted into a rooming accommodation? What are the costs and what are the processing costs usually? So that part of our presentation about the rooming accommodation, those at section 4 and 5, that basically means that you can do a material change of use, so convert an existing dwelling into a rooming accommodation, and it's prohibited from assessment by council. So long as you're meeting those provisions, you won't need a town planning permit, but you will, however, still need a building permit. So get in touch with a building certifier to go through the cost process and timeframes associated with that.
So we will be releasing the slides too. So that just in relation to that, Franklin, it's the top section of that slide is what you will need to look at for converting a house or existing building into that to hit those exemptions.
Okay. Well, I think that pretty much brings us to the end. 45 minutes. That's not too bad. I hope we didn't bore everyone to death. It can be a bit taxing going through legislative changes and trying to make it sound interesting and apply it to reality. So I hope everyone got something positive out of this.
Do we dare try to summarize?
Do we try to summarize? Mike's going to do a summary of the grammar.
Just a finishing statement. I think so. If you're doing extension, nothing's changed. Yeah. You're going through the same process we were doing 6 months ago, right? So straight away you can probably look at that and go, yeah, all right, I know what we're doing. It's as it was. If you're doing an MCU, as you kind of got an idea of what throughout our discussion today, it's still very much a shifting goalpost to some extent. I've got clients at the moment who are doing, like massive houses, and they're trying to navigate the best approval path. At this point, what we're trying to do on our end is have a meeting with us, the client, and the certifier and the architect to talk through the options and pros and cons of each way. Until we have some further examples from certifiers of what's happening on their end in terms of getting those relaxes through. Unfortunately, there won't be a lot of certainty around it. And at this point, we're kind of, in a holding pattern, I guess, until enough people try it, and then we get some sort of feedback from council, and that's just unfortunately where we're at. So,
I did just have a quick flick through the attendees. There are a bunch of, I've seen some other planners in here and some certifiers. If anyone else has any comments to add, please raise your hand. So you can just click the raise hand button. I believe I can unmute you if you wanted to say anything. So if anyone's got anything to add, I'll give you 5 seconds. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up and leave it there. Everything's been recorded, so we will send this out to everyone who registered to attend, so you can rewatch it. All right. Let's call it there. Thanks, everyone. And you all have a wonderful day. And if you need anything further from us, you know where to find us. Cheers.
thanks, guys.
Bye.